Sociology 345, Video Lecture 21. There are many parallels between the punk subculture in London in the 1970s and early 21st century Japanese subcultures. Well, that's what Kawamura tells us, and so one of our jobs as we read through this book is going to be to think about what those parallels are, and not only with the punk subculture of the 1970s, but we'll want to also be thinking about the film we're watching on Dogtown and the skate subculture of California, also emerging in the 1970s. Now, at first glance, these two subcultures, one from Japan in recent times and the 1970s punk subculture, they don't obviously look similar. One is dominated by the principle of cute, the other by menace and dread and destruction. So what are the parallels? Well, they're both what Hevditch called spectacular subcultures, and Kawamura cites Hevditch in saying that subculture forms in the space between surveillance and the evasion of surveillance. It translates the fact of being under scrutiny into the pleasure of being watched. And surveillance, of course, is a feature of modern life, but especially for the younger members of society, for teenagers and children who have relatively little power in society and are under the control of adults and constant surveillance. Kawamura goes on to say that cultural studies, which emerges in the 1970s in relation to the writing of Hevditch and others, these subcultures that they studied were always seen as symbolic representations of the structural problems of class. We saw that very clearly with the punk subculture. It's about working class, middle class, upper class tensions worked out around symbolically around race and status, and it's a battle over meaning. And we've talked a lot about this idea of hegemony, a term coined by Antonio Gramsci, who was a political writer and communist imprisoned by Mussolini, and he described hegemony as a feature of modern capitalist societies. What he was trying to do was update Marx a bit, and rather than just relying on the idea of false consciousness as this sort of top-down imposition of ideas upon everyone else, hegemony speaks more to the idea of a give and take, that the dominant ideology is present, the false consciousness, so to speak, is present, but it's not all powerful. There are cracks and fissures within it, and there are always alternative voices. And it becomes sort of a game between the dominant culture and these alternative voices, as we saw with the punks, where the dominant culture effectively tries to incorporate these alternative voices within it as a way to control and continue its hegemonic power. So it's a more subtle idea than false consciousness, but it gets us to the same place, this idea that there is an affirmative culture in critical theoretical terms, or a dominant culture, a false consciousness in Marxist terms, but it's not all powerful. There's a give and take. And that's really where the similarities lie with these subcultures, these spectacular subcultures of Japan in the recent era, and the subcultures of the 1970s, this idea of hegemony, and this give and take, this challenge. One of the things we want to think about with Kawamura is these subcultures, like cosplay, for example, really need to be understood in the context of the larger fashion industry, the global fashion industry. So they look very, very strange to us, perhaps, and kind of nerdy or just bizarre. But they really are connected to something that we're all, even mainstream people, are connected to, which is this global fashion industry. Again, you want to be thinking about this question, whether Japanese subcultures have the same or similar determinants as those in the West. And we also want to be thinking, as Kawamura walks us through these subcultures, how the existing theories, like the ones that Hebdige uses and the ones that are inspired by Marx and based on class, to what extent they're applicable to these particular Japanese phenomena. And you might be thinking ahead to that also as a final exam question. You never know. So let's talk a little bit about what Kawamura does in the beginning of the book, giving us a kind of cultural history of Japan. We can start with the Meiji era, 1868 to 1912, and the government's attempt to enact what they call civilization and enlightenment. And one very important aspect of this was opening up to the West in terms of culture. And what you see is that by government edict, the emperor and the military and some of the civil servant professions begin to be required to wear Western fashion, just fashion imported from the West to replace the traditional Japanese clothing. And this begins to be then taken up by the upper classes, becomes a marker of status, partly because it's just fashion, and partly because it's expensive. Who can afford to import this clothing or pay people to create this clothing? So Western fashion takes hold then in this period and continues through the Taisho period, 1912 to 1926, where Western fashion continues to be a marker of status. More and more people take it up. It starts to become cheaper, and it starts to again function throughout the class structure as a marker of status. So we've got Japan now moving away from its isolationism into an embrace of this global culture of the fashion industry, which of course is centered in cities like New York and Paris and Milan. The 1950s and 60s, after World War II and the rebuilding of Japan uh, under the auspices of the United States, Japan begins to just import directly these cultural models from U.S. culture, the housewife and the fashion that goes along with it, the businessman and the fashion that goes along with it, the Western fashion. And here we have a nice example of Japanese tourists, early 1960s, fully embracing the Western fashion. So at this point, Japan is connected, fully connected to the global culture, the culture of fashion, um, but it doesn't have its own identity. It's simply imitating and borrowing from and adopting the Western model. It's not until the 1970s actually that Japanese designers uh, start to have a presence in in the fashion world and start to make showings in Paris and New York, etc. Kenzo, with this distinctly Japanese aesthetic, continues today. You can find this from a recent Vogue. Issey Miyake, also continues to be an important designer. The idea here was that they were actually wanting to make Tokyo one of the fashion centers. And this was very difficult because, on the one hand, although you had these Japanese designers who are now well respected and making their mark in in the fashion world, Paris, Milan, New York, there wasn't really in Japan the organizational structure of high culture fashion, haute couture. Um, this is centered still in Paris, New York, Milan, where you have a very sort of top-down organizational approach where designers work freely as artists with an industry organized around them, and their designs, these very sort of bizarre, interesting, aesthetic designs are shown every year, and then their teams and their companies, etc., reinterpret these high fashion designs for the public market, and things sort of trickle down into eventually to the malls where we buy them, and the influence is very much top down. And this kind of because Japan had really, in terms of fashion, had only been involved in kind of importing and imitating fashion that was already created in the West. They didn't have this kind of industry in place. So although they had designers, they had nothing else to create that industry. And what begins to happen in Japan, and this happens in other places as well, but very quickly in Japan, because that other structure wasn't there, is you start to see the dominance and importance of street fashion taking over, where the youth, the public, are the ones who are creative, and the industry develops around them. The industry becomes dependent on them, as if they're sort of like playing the role of designer. And this happens very quickly and very effectively in Japan, because there wasn't this already top-down industry structure in place that this kind of organization might have to fight against. So since the youth are so important to this kind of fashion, what we're calling subcultures as connected to fashion, it's important to understand these Japanese youth and the kinds of social forces that are in effect and shaping their ideas and attitudes and meanings and culture. And we talked a little bit about this before at the very beginning of the semester, but what we had in Japan in the 1980s was really an unprecedented kind of economic growth. The final sort of outcome of the post-World War II rebuilding, where their economy was just going great guns. And then the big crash and collapse of the 1990s. See this graph in the back that represents real estate prices in Japan peaking very high in the 1990s, growing very quickly through the 80s, and then just as quickly crashing down in the 1990s. And so you have these Japanese youth coming of age in this period of decline. And so what does that mean for them? Well, what they're seeing is what was previously perceived to be a lifetime right, lifetime employment. That whole system disappeared. Nobody any longer is guaranteed lifetime employment. You see the rise of unemployment, and especially underemployment. People working part-time, people working in jobs that are quote-unquote beneath them, beneath their level of education. You see that marriage rates and fertility are on the decline. The numbers of single mother households are on the increase, partly because of divorce, partly because of just having children without marrying in the first place. And as I mentioned, divorce rates are increasing greatly. And out of this develops this kind of social panic around hikikomori, which is the flip side of these spectacular subcultures. The youth in retreat, um, the dark side of all of these social elements, youth who hide out in their rooms, who become recluse, never leaving their buildings or their bedrooms if they can, connected to the world only through the internet. This becomes this sort of social problem, a panic, regardless of how big it actually is. It's it's important to the culture as a lesson because it is so opposite of the kind of collective spirit of Japanese culture. This is complete isolationism. Then, of course, is the flip side of what we're examining in the rest of the readings, which are these spectacular subcultures. We'll do more of that next time.